The Woodsman. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the forest holds its breath between darkness and light, Thomas wakes not to an alarm but to the stirring of wrens in the eaves above his bed. Their soft chirping filters through the gaps in the hand-hewn logs of his cabin, a gentle reveille that has marked his mornings for more years than he can count. He lies still for a moment, eyes closed, listening. The wrens. The whisper of wind through pine needles. The distant murmur of the creek that runs behind his home, swollen now with early autumn rains. These sounds are his clock, his calendar, his connection to everything that matters. When Thomas finally opens his eyes, the room is painted in shades of gray and amber. A single window above his bed frames a rectangle of sky where the first hints of dawn are beginning to blush. He watches a cloud drift past, unhurried, and he smiles. There is nowhere he needs to be except here. Nothing he needs to do except what the day itself asks of him. He rises slowly, his body moving with the careful deliberation of a man who has learned to honor his limits. At 63, Thomas is lean and weathered, his hands calloused from work, his face lined by sun and wind and countless seasons of contentment. He pulls on wool socks, thick ones he knitted himself last winter, and pads across the smooth wooden floor to the wood stove in the corner. The embers from last night's fire still glow faintly beneath a blanket of ash. Thomas kneels, his knees creaking softly, and feeds the coals with kindling. Thin strips of cedar bark, dry twigs snapped to the perfect length. He arranges them carefully, building a small teepee structure, then adds slightly larger pieces. Only when the architecture is right does he blow gently into the heart of it. The embers brighten, orange blooming to yellow, and then, with a soft crackling that sounds almost like satisfaction, the kindling catches. He adds a few split logs of oak and closes the stove door, adjusting the damper just so. The cabin will be warm by the time he returns from his morning walk. Everything in its time. Everything in its season. Thomas fills a kettle from the clay water filter by the sink and sets it on the stovetop to heat. While he waits, he steps out onto the porch. The cold hits him immediately. Autumn mornings in these mountains carry an edge, but he doesn't retreat. Instead, he breathes it in deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs and wake his body from the inside out. His breath plumes white before him, and he watches it dissipate into the gathering light. The cabin sits in a small clearing, surrounded on three sides by forest, hemlock and oak, maple and pine, all standing sentinel in the pre-dawn dimness. To the east, where the trees open up, the land slopes gently down toward the creek. Thomas can just make out its silver thread through the undergrowth, catching the earliest light. Everything is still wet with dew. Spider webs stretch between branches, each strand beaded with moisture, transforming ordinary spaces into something jeweled and delicate. Thomas notices these things. He has trained himself over the years to see them, these small perfections that the hurried world rushes past. A deer emerges from the tree lean to his left, moving with that peculiar grace that never fails to quiet something in his chest. She's a doe, her coat already thickening for winter, her ears tall and alert. She spots him immediately. Thomas makes no effort to hide, and they regard each other across the clearing. He doesn't move. She doesn't flee. They simply exist together for a long moment, two creatures acknowledging each other's right to be exactly where they are. Then she dips her head and begins to graze on the clover that grows near the forest edge, and Thomas knows he has been accepted. This happens more often now, he's noticed. The animals seem to sense that he means no harm, that he moves through their world with respect rather than dominion. The kettle begins to whistle softly from inside, and Thomas returns to the cabin, closing the door with care so as not to startle the doe. He makes his morning tea, wild mint he harvested in summer, dried and stored in a glass jar, and carries the steaming cup back to the porch. He settles into the rocking chair he built from fallen ash wood, wraps a wool blanket around his shoulders, and sips slowly as the sun begins its climb. This is Thomas's favorite hour. The in-between time. the threshold between night and day when the forest seems to shift from one state of being to another. He has learned more in these quiet morning hours than in all his years before coming to the woods. He hadn't always lived this way. There had been another life once, a life of concrete and deadlines, of fluorescent lights and the constant hum of anxiety that he'd mistaken for ambition. He'd been successful by the world's measures. A career, an apartment, a retirement account that grew with steady dependability. But there had been something hollow at the center of it all, something that echoed when he lay awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and wondering why contentment felt so elusive. The change hadn't come suddenly. It had grown in him slowly, like a seed germinating in darkness, sending out roots before the first green shoot ever broke the surface. A camping trip that left him reluctant to return. Books about homesteading devoured late into the night. Weekends spent learning to identify plants, to start fires without matches, to move quietly through wild spaces. And then, finally, the decision. The great unburdening. The selling of things that had once seemed essential. The drive up into these mountains with everything that mattered packed into the bed of an old truck. The purchase of 5 acres of forest and the slow, methodical work of building a life with his own hands. That had been 12 years ago. Now, as the sun clears the ridge to the east and spills golden light across the clearing, Thomas finishes his tea and stands. The doe has moved off into the forest, but her presence lingers like a blessing. The day is waiting, full of small tasks that will fill his hours with purpose. He returns inside and dresses properly. Canvas work pants worn soft with age, a flannel shirt in faded red, a vest with pockets for the small tools he might need. He pulls on his boots, leather ones he resoles himself each winter, and collects his gathering basket from its hook by the door. Thomas steps off the porch and begins his morning walk, following the path his feet have worn over thousands of similar mornings. The path curves around the side of the cabin and into the forest proper, where the canopy closes overhead and the light becomes dappled and green gold. His steps are quiet on the carpet of fallen leaves. He walks slowly, attentively, pausing often to observe. Here, a cluster of late-season chanterelles growing from the base of an oak, their sunset orange caps pushing through the leaf litter. He kneels and examines them carefully, checking for the telltale ridges that distinguish them from false chanterelles, then harvests a few with his knife, leaving the smallest to continue growing. They'll make a fine breakfast. Further along the path, he spots the glossy leaves of wintergreen poking through the duff. He picks a single leaf and crushes it between his fingers, releasing that unmistakable scent, sharp and sweet at once, then touches his fingers to his tongue. The taste brings a smile. These plants are old friends now, each with their gifts and lessons. The creek is running high and clear over its bed of smooth stones. Thomas crosses on the stepping stones he placed years ago, each foot finding its position from memory. On the far bank, he checks his small fish trap, a woven basket he submerges in a quiet eddy. Inside, 3 brook trout swim in circles, their spotted backs iridescent in the morning light. Thomas lifts the trap and studies them. They're good-sized, enough for several meals. He says a quiet thank you, to the fish, to the creek, to the abundance that sustains him, and secures the trap over his shoulder. He continues his circuit through the woods, gathering as he goes. A handful of black walnuts from beneath a tree he's been watching, their hulls now soft enough to indicate ripeness. Wild grapes hanging in purple clusters from a vine that's climbed high into a hickory. A few stalks of cattail from the marshy area near the spring, their roots edible and nourishing. The forest provides, as it always has, and Thomas takes only what he needs, only what will be used and honored. This is the contract he's made with this place, and he has never broken it. By the time he returns to the cabin, his basket is full and the sun has fully claimed the sky. The morning has moved from cool to comfortable, and Thomas sheds his vest as he climbs the porch steps. Inside, the cabin is warm and welcoming, the wood stove radiating steady heat. He sets his basket on the wooden counter he built beside the deep sink and begins to sort his harvest. The fish go into a bowl of clean water. The mushrooms need cleaning. He brushes away dirt and debris with a soft cloth, never washing them, preserving their delicate flavor. The walnuts go into a bucket to soak, the grapes into a colander. As he works, his hands moving through these familiar motions, Thomas hums quietly to himself. There's a contentment in this that he could never adequately explain to someone who hasn't lived it. This direct relationship with sustenance, this intimate knowledge of where food comes from and what it costs the earth to provide it. He takes 2 of the trout and cleans them at the sink, working efficiently, wasting nothing. The cleaned fish go into a cast iron pan with a bit of rendered fat from the deer he was gifted last winter by a neighboring homesteader. While they sizzle gently, he scrambles eggs from his 3 chickens, Henrietta, Mabel, and Pip, who live in a coop on the south side of the cabin. He adds the foraged mushrooms, their earthy aroma filling the small space. Thomas plates his breakfast and carries it to the small table by the window. As he eats, he watches a pair of nuthatches working their way down the trunk of a nearby pine, searching for insects in the bark crevices. Their jerky movements make him smile. Everything in nature has its own particular way of being, its own rhythm and reason. The food tastes like morning, like forest, like exactly where he is. This, Thomas thinks, is what he'd been missing in that other life. Not luxury or convenience, but authenticity. The simple, undeniable truth of living as part of the world rather than separate from it. When his plate is clean, he washes it along with the pan, using water he pumps from the well, heated on the stove. He adds the fish scraps to his compost bucket. They'll feed the garden that's already begun to settle in for winter. Everything returns. Everything cycles. Nothing is truly lost. The morning stretches before Thomas like an open hand, full of possibility but demanding nothing. After cleaning up from breakfast, he steps back outside to tend to his chickens. The coop is a small structure he built in his 2nd year here, when he'd finally felt confident enough in his ability to sustain himself that he could take on the responsibility of other lives. It's made from reclaimed wood and sits nestled against the south-facing wall of the cabin, where it catches the winter sun and stays protected from the north wind. "Good morning, ladies," Thomas says softly as he unlatches the door. The chickens come bustling out in a flurry of feathers and soft clucking. Henrietta first, as always, her rust-colored plumage catching the light. She's the bold one, the leader of their small flock. Mabel follows, darker and more reserved, and finally Pip, the smallest, a speckled hen who'd arrived as a gift from the same neighbor who'd given him the venison. Thomas scatters scratched grain across the ground, and the chickens set to work with serious intent, their heads bobbing in that peculiar mechanical way as they peck and scratch. He refills their water from the rain barrel, checking that it's clean and fresh, then props open the nesting box to collect the 2 eggs that weren't there during his pre-dawn gathering. "Thank you," he tells them, as he always does. Gratitude is a practice here, not a platitude. He leaves the coop door open so the chickens can range freely through the clearing. They'll return on their own at dusk, as they always do, driven by instinct and the safety of their roost. In the meantime, they'll eat insects and forage for seeds, reducing their dependence on his stores and living the kind of life chickens were meant to live. Thomas walks the perimeter of his garden next, a ritual he performs every few days. The garden is smaller now than it was in high summer. Many of the beds have been put to rest for winter, covered with layers of leaves and compost that will break down over the cold months and feed next year's growth. But there are still things growing, the last of the kale, dark green and sweet after the first frost, a patch of hardy chard, winter squash that sprawls across a bed, its vines beginning to yellow as the squash cure in the autumn sun. He kneels beside the squash and runs his hand over the nearest one, a butternut, its skin smooth and tan. He knocks on it gently, listening for the hollow sound that indicates ripeness. Not quite yet. Another week, perhaps. Patience is something the garden teaches over and over again. You cannot rush what needs time. A groundhog has been testing his fence line, he notices. There are fresh diggings near the northeast corner, where the chicken wire meets the wooden posts. Thomas examines the attempted breach with a mixture of admiration and determination. The groundhog is only doing what groundhogs do, trying to survive, to eat, to prepare for winter. He bears it no ill will. But he also needs these vegetables, and so the fence must hold. He returns to his small tool shed, really just a lean-to attached to the cabin, and retrieves some additional wire and his tools. For the next hour, he works on reinforcing the fence, driving stakes deeper, securing the wire more firmly to the earth. It's repetitive work, physical but not taxing, and his mind is free to wander. He thinks about the deer from this morning, about the way she'd looked at him without fear. He thinks about his daughter, who lives 4 hours away in the city, who visits twice a year and calls every few weeks. She worries about him, he knows, though she tries not to let it show. "Are you lonely?" she'd asked during her last visit, standing in this very garden, looking around at the forest that pressed in from all sides. "No," he'd told her honestly. "I'm alone, but I'm not lonely. They're different things." She'd nodded, but he wasn't sure she truly understood. How could she? She'd grown up in the suburbs, raised by a younger version of himself who'd been too caught up in career and obligations to teach her the language of trees and bird calls. By the time he'd found this life, she'd already left for college, already been shaped by the world he'd helped create for her. He doesn't regret it. She's happy, successful in her own way, building a life that makes sense to her. But sometimes he wishes he could give her this profound sense of rightness, of belonging to a place and having it belong to you. Thomas finishes his fence repairs and stands, stretching his back. The sun is higher now, approaching midday, and his stomach tells him it's been hours since breakfast. But there's one more task he wants to complete before he breaks for lunch. He walks deeper into the woods, following a different path this time, one that leads upslope toward a grove of oak trees he's been monitoring. Last week, he'd noticed signs of disease on one of the older oaks, a fungal infection that was spreading through the bark. The tree was dying, and while this was simply part of the forest's natural cycle, Thomas also knew that dead-standing timber represented a resource he couldn't afford to waste. The tree is exactly where he'd left it in his mind's map, a massive white oak that must be 200 years old, maybe more. Its trunk is easily 3 feet in diameter, and many of its branches are still alive, still bearing leaves that have turned the deep burgundy of oak in autumn. But the rot has progressed since his last visit. He can see it in the way the bark has begun to split and peel near the base, in the shelf fungi that have emerged like small orange plateaus from the wounded wood. "You've had a good life," Thomas says to the tree, placing his palm against its rough bark. "A long life. Thank you for all you've given." He's not being fanciful. Trees do give oxygen, shade, habitat, food for countless creatures, and yes, eventually, their wood for warmth and building. This oak has stood here since before his grandfather was born, has weathered storms and droughts, has fed squirrels and birds and insects, has sheltered deer and raccoons, and who knows what else. Its life has mattered. Its death will matter too. Thomas takes out his folding saw and makes a few test cuts low on the trunk, checking the progress of the rot. It's advanced, but not so far that the wood is entirely compromised. He'll need to fell this tree soon before winter, and spend the colder months processing it into firewood and perhaps some lumber if the heartwood is still sound enough. But not today. Today is for observation, for planning, for the slow work of understanding what needs to be done and when. He makes mental notes about the direction the tree should fall, where he'll need to clear brush to make a safe work area, how many days of labor it will represent. As he stands there contemplating, a raven lands in the upper branches and regards him with bright, intelligent eyes. Ravens are clever birds, and this one seems to be assessing him with the same careful attention he's giving to the tree. "Hello up there," Thomas calls softly. The raven cocks its head, then releases a single croaking call that echoes through the forest. Another raven answers from somewhere deeper in the trees, and then the first one spreads its wings and glides away, a shadow passing between shadows. Thomas smiles. The forest is never truly silent, never truly empty. There's always something living, breathing, moving through the spaces between the trees. You just have to slow down enough to notice. He makes his way back toward the cabin, taking a different route this time, always varying his path so that no single trail becomes too worn, so that his presence here remains light and transient. Along the way, he pauses to dig a few Jerusalem artichoke tubers from a patch he'd planted 3 years ago and which has now naturalized, spreading on its own. The tubers are knobby and strange-looking, but roasted they'll be sweet and nutty, another element of his evening meal. By the time he reaches the cabin, the sun is directly overhead and his shadow pools small and dark at his feet. The chickens have found a patch of dirt near the garden and are taking dust baths, fluffing their feathers and looking utterly content. Thomas watches them for a moment, appreciating their simple satisfaction. Inside, he prepares a simple lunch. The eggs he collected this morning, scrambled with wild onion greens he'd gathered earlier in the week and kept wrapped in a damp cloth. A slice of the bread he bakes once a week in his cast-iron Dutch oven, the last of the grapes from this morning's foraging. He eats at the table again, looking out the window, watching the play of light through the trees. After lunch, there's the comfortable fatigue that comes from morning exertion and a full stomach. Thomas allows himself the luxury of rest. He settles into the armchair beside the wood stove, an old leather chair he'd salvaged from someone's curbside years ago, the one piece of furniture he'd brought from his previous life, and picks up the book from the small table beside it. It's a collection of essays by a naturalist who lived a century ago, writing about these very mountains. Thomas has read it before, more than once, but good books are like old friends. You can revisit them and find new meaning each time. He reads slowly, pausing often to gaze out the window or into the middle distance, letting ideas settle and integrate. Outside, the afternoon light has turned golden and thick, the quality it takes on in autumn when the sun hangs lower in the sky. A breeze has picked up, and through the window Thomas can see leaves spiraling down from the maples, their descent slow and meandering, like thoughts drifting toward sleep. He must doze off, because when he opens his eyes again the light has shifted. The book has closed in his lap, and an hour has passed. Maybe more. Thomas doesn't feel guilty about this. Sleep when you're tired is another lesson from the natural world, another way of honoring what the body needs. He rises and stokes the fire, adding another log. The temperature has dropped a few degrees, and the cabin's warmth feels like an embrace. He drinks a cup of water, then another, standing at the sink and looking out the small window above it. The afternoon is moving toward evening. Soon he'll need to think about dinner, about closing up the chicken coop, about all the small rituals that mark the transition from day to night. But for now, there's still daylight to use, still work to be done. Thomas pulls on his vest again and heads outside to his woodshed. The shed is well stocked. He'd spent much of the previous winter and early spring cutting and splitting wood, building up a supply that would see him through the coming cold months. But wood is like money in the bank out here. You can never have too much, and the work of preparing it is endless. He selects several rounds of oak from the aging pile, wood he'd cut last year that has now dried and seasoned. Using a splitting maul and wedges, he begins the rhythmic work of breaking the rounds into stove-sized pieces. The maul rises and falls. The wood splits with satisfying cracks. The pile of split wood grows. This is meditation in motion. The repetitive action, the physical exertion, the immediate visible result. There's something deeply satisfying about it. In his old life, work had been abstract, measured in emails sent and meetings attended and documents produced. Here, work is concrete. You split wood, and you have split wood. You plant seeds, and plants grow. The cause and effect are immediate and honest. After an hour of splitting, Thomas has added another good supply to his covered woodpile near the cabin door. He's breathing hard, his body warm despite the cooling air, and there's a pleasant ache in his shoulders and back. He drives the maul into the splitting stump and leaves it there, ready for next time. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across the clearing. Thomas walks down to the creek to wash his hands and face in the cold water. The shock of it is bracing, clearing his head, reminding him that he's alive, that his body works, that this life he's chosen continues to choose him back. He returns to the cabin and begins preparing dinner. The remaining trout gets wrapped in wild grape leaves with herbs from the small bundles he dried over the summer, thyme and oregano and sage. He'll cook it over the coals of the wood stove. The Jerusalem artichokes get scrubbed and tossed with a little oil and salt, then set in a cast-iron skillet to roast. There's still kale in the garden, so he retrieves a few leaves, chops them roughly, and sautés them with garlic he'd grown and braided into long ropes that now hang from the rafters. As he cooks, the cabin fills with wonderful smells, earthy, herbal, rich. Thomas moves efficiently through these tasks, each motion practiced and sure. Cooking, like so much else here, is an act of transformation. Taking what the earth provides and turning it into sustenance, into pleasure, into the fuel that will carry him through to tomorrow. He plates his food carefully, because even when you're alone, even when no one will see it, presentation matters. It's a way of honoring the meal, of acknowledging the gift. He lights a candle on the table, not for necessity, as there's still daylight, but for ceremony, for beauty, for the simple pleasure of watching a flame dance. Thomas eats slowly, tasting everything, grateful for everything. The fish is delicate and sweet. The roasted tubers are caramelized at the edges, creamy inside. The kale is slightly bitter, perfectly balanced by the garlic. This is food that tells a story. His story, the story of this place, the story of the season and the sun and the soil. As he finishes, the last of the daylight is fading from the windows. As darkness settles over the clearing, Thomas lights the oil lamps he keeps stationed around the cabin. One on the table, one beside his chair, one near the kitchen counter. He's never bothered with solar panels or a generator. The soft, warm glow of lamplight feels right to him, feels in keeping with the pace of this life. Electric light is harsh, immediate, demanding. Lamplight is gentle, forgiving, honest about its limitations. He washes his dinner dishes in water heated on the stove, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind drifts. Outside, he can hear the first calls of the barred owls beginning their evening conversations. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? Their call sounds almost like laughter, like they're sharing some private joke about the world. Thomas dries the dishes and puts them away in the simple open shelving he'd built along one wall. Everything in the cabin has its place, and everything returns to that place when its purpose is fulfilled. This kind of order isn't about rigidity, it's about respect. When you have less, you care for what you have more carefully. He moves to his chair and settles in, adjusting the lamp so its light falls across his lap. But tonight he doesn't reach for his book. Instead, he simply sits, his hands resting on the worn leather arms of the chair, and allows himself to remember. The decision to come here hadn't been dramatic. There was no single moment of crisis, no breakdown or tragedy that forced his hand. It had been quieter than that, more insidious. A growing sense that he was living someone else's life, following a script he'd never agreed to but had somehow memorized anyway. He'd been 49 years old, working in commercial real estate development. Good at it, too. He'd helped transform neighborhoods, overseen projects worth millions of dollars, earned respect from colleagues and competitors alike. His daughter was grown, launched into her own life. His marriage had ended years before, amicably if sadly, when he and his ex-wife had finally admitted they'd become strangers sharing an address. There should have been satisfaction in all he'd accomplished. Instead, there was only a persistent emptiness, like a low-grade fever that never quite broke. Thomas remembers the exact evening when something shifted. He'd been working late, as usual, reviewing contracts in his office on the 14th floor. His window looked out over the city, thousands of lights, thousands of lives, all of it buzzing with energy and purpose. And he'd thought, suddenly and clearly, I have no idea what any of this is for. Not the project he was working on. Not his career. Not the life he'd built so carefully, so deliberately, checking off all the boxes that society said mattered. He'd tried to shake the feeling off, told himself it was just exhaustion, just the stress of a particularly complicated deal. But the thought had taken root. Over the following weeks and months, it had grown, sending out tendrils that wrapped around everything he did. Each meeting felt more pointless. Each success felt more hollow. Each day felt more like he was betraying something essential in himself, though he couldn't have named what. He started taking long walks on weekends, driving out of the city to small state parks where he could hike for hours without seeing another person. And in those spaces, something in him began to breathe again. The quiet settled him. The green steadied him. The simple act of putting one foot in front of the other on a trail, with no agenda beyond moving through the landscape, felt more real than anything in his professional life. I was dying, Thomas says aloud now, his voice soft in the lamplit cabin. I just didn't know it yet. The owls call again, and he listens, letting their voices weave into his memories. He'd started reading, voraciously, hungrily, anything he could find about people who'd left conventional lives behind. Homesteaders, naturalists, hermits, monks, anyone who'd chosen simplicity over success as the world defined it. He read Thoreau and Abbey, read modern homesteading blogs and books about permaculture and wilderness survival. He read about people who'd walked away from careers, from marriages, from everything, in search of something more true. And slowly, a plan had formed. Not an escape plan exactly. He wasn't running from anything. More like a migration plan, the kind of instinct that must drive birds south when the seasons shift. He was simply following an internal compass that had finally, after decades of being ignored, made itself impossible to dismiss. He'd started small. Sold his condo and moved to a modest apartment. Began eliminating possessions, discovering with each carload to the donation center that he didn't miss any of it. Took wilderness skills courses on weekends. Fire building, plant identification, basic carpentry. Saved money with a focus he'd never brought to anything before, because now he knew what he was saving for. His daughter had been puzzled at first, then worried. "Dad, are you okay?" she'd asked over dinner one night, studying his face like she was looking for signs of illness. "You're acting so different." "I'm acting like myself," he'd told her. Maybe for the first time. His colleagues thought he was having a midlife crisis. His ex-wife, when he told her, had simply nodded and said, "I wondered when you'd figure it out." That had surprised him. "Figure what out?" he'd asked. "That you were never really happy doing any of this. You were good at it, but you were never happy." The truth of that had stung, but it had also freed something in him. Thomas shifts in his chair now, adding another log to the stove even though the cabin is warm enough. The action is more about ritual than need, the comforting routine of fire tending, the small acts that mark the passage of evening. He'd spent months searching for the right land. It couldn't be too remote. He needed to be within reasonable distance of a town for supplies, for medical care if needed. But it had to be isolated enough to provide the solitude he craved, the sense of being held by wilderness rather than simply visiting it. When he'd found these 5 acres, he'd known immediately. The realtor had apologized for the property. No road access beyond a rough track, no structures, no utilities, heavy forest cover. "It's pretty raw," she'd said, as if this were a liability. But Thomas had stood in this very clearing, smaller than, more overgrown, and felt something in his chest unlock. The creek running through the property. The mixed forest of hardwoods and pines. The south-facing slope that would catch winter sun. The sense of being held by the mountains, of being welcomed into their folds. "I'll take it," he'd said. The first year had been the hardest. He'd lived in a tent while building the cabin, working through spring and summer and into fall, racing against the coming winter. Every skill he'd learned in those preparatory months had been tested. Some days he'd been sure he was making a terrible mistake, that he'd gone too far, that he'd romanticized something that was actually just hard and lonely and foolish. But he'd kept going. Cut and peeled logs. Mixed mortar. Fitted joints. Built a roof that would shed rain and snow. Installed the wood stove he'd bought used from a neighbor 5 miles distant. Created a space that was small but sound, simple but sufficient. When he'd finally moved inside, when he'd spent his first night sleeping within walls he'd built with his own hands, Thomas had lain awake for hours, listening to the cabin settle, feeling the reality of what he'd done. He'd expected to feel proud, or satisfied, or accomplished. Instead, he'd felt quiet. Still. Like an instrument that had been tuned to the wrong key for decades and had finally found its proper note. "That was 12 years ago," Thomas says to the empty cabin, to the listening dark beyond the windows. 12 years. It astonishes him sometimes how quickly time moves here despite, or perhaps because of, the slowness of the days. In his old life, time had felt sticky, resistant, each week a slog to get through. Here, seasons flow into one another like water. Spring's unfurling, summer's abundance, autumn's settling, winter's rest. They cycle and return, and each time they feel both familiar and new. The learning curve had been steep. That first winter, he'd nearly run out of firewood, had miscalculated how much he'd need. He'd burned green wood out of desperation, filling the cabin with smoke and barely generating heat. He'd learned to judge firewood by weight and sound, to season it properly, to plan 2 years ahead. His first garden had been a disaster. Planted too late, wrong varieties for the altitude, overrun by pests he didn't know how to manage. He'd harvested enough for perhaps a week's worth of meals and considered it a victory. Each year since, the garden had improved. Each year, he'd learned more about the soil, the microclimate, the particular challenges of growing food at this elevation. The loneliness he'd feared had come, but not in the way he'd expected. He didn't miss people exactly. Not the constant presence of them, the social obligations, the small talk and performance. But there were moments when he'd have liked to share something. A particularly beautiful sunrise, or the satisfaction of a well-split pile of wood, or simply a meal with someone sitting across the table. His daughter's visits helped. The occasional interaction with his neighbors, a loose network of people living similarly remote lives, who checked on one another and traded goods and skills. A woman 3 miles to the west who kept bees and traded honey for his walnuts. A couple to the north who raised goats and made cheese. An elderly man to the east who'd lived this way for 40 years and had taught Thomas more about reading weather and tracking animals than any book could convey. These connections, sparse as they were, felt more genuine than anything he'd known in the city. There was no pretense out here. When someone said, "Let me know if you need anything," they meant it. When you helped a neighbor clear a fallen tree or mend a fence, you were investing in a network of mutual support that might one day save your life. Thomas rises from his chair and moves to the window, looking out into the darkness. The moon hasn't risen yet, and the forest is a wall of black beyond the small pool of light cast by the cabin windows. But his eyes are adjusted now, and he can make out shapes. The darker verticals of tree trunks, the slightly lighter horizontal of the ground, the occasional movement of leaves stirring in the night breeze. Somewhere out there, the deer is bedded down. The groundhog is in its burrow. The owls are hunting. The whole vast, intricate web of life is going on, has been going on, will continue going on regardless of whether he's here to witness it. And yet, being here, being part of it, even in his small human way, feels like the most important thing he's ever done. Not important in the way his career had been important, measured in dollars or impact or recognition. Important in a deeper sense. Important in the way breathing is important, or sleeping, or listening. Important because it's true. He thinks about what his daughter had asked during her last visit. "Are you happy here?" He'd hesitated before answering, because happy seemed like the wrong word. Too small, too simple, too focused on feeling rather than being. "I'm at peace," he'd finally said. "I'm where I'm supposed to be." She'd nodded, and he'd seen something in her face. Maybe relief, maybe envy, maybe just love. "I'm glad, Dad. I really am. Even though I worry sometimes." "I know. And I appreciate the worrying. But I'm okay. More than okay." Thomas turns from the window and begins his evening routine. He banks the fire in the stove, adjusting it so it will burn low and steady through the night. He fills a glass jar with water from the filter and places it by his bedside. The air gets dry overnight, and he likes to have water within reach. He winds the small clock on the shelf, though he rarely needs it for anything beyond curiosity about the hour. He washes his face in cool water at the basin, brushes his teeth, changes into the thermal underwear he sleeps in during the cooler months. Each action is deliberate, mindful, part of the ceremony of closing one day and preparing for the next. Before bed, he steps outside one final time. This is his favorite moment of the day, the last greeting to the darkness, the final breath of night air, the checking of the sky and the sensing of the weather to come. The stars are brilliant tonight, undimmed by any competing light. The Milky Way is a river of light overhead, and Thomas tips his head back to take it in. He can pick out Orion rising in the east, the Pleiades cluster, the Big Dipper pointing toward Polaris. These patterns, these ancient arrangements of distant suns, have guided travelers for millennia. They guide him too in their way, reminding him of his smallness, his briefness, and somehow making both of those things feel not diminishing but freeing. A meteor streaks across the sky, there and gone in an instant, and Thomas smiles. Gift from the universe. Reminder that everything is in motion, everything is temporary, everything is exactly as it should be in this moment. He can smell frost coming. The air has that particular edge, that crystalline quality that means by morning the ground will be white and crunchy underfoot, the water in the chicken's dish will need breaking, his breath will plume thick in the pre-dawn darkness. Winter is approaching, with all its challenges and all its particular beauties. Thomas is ready for it. The woodshed is stocked, the root cellar is full, the cabin is sound. He has everything he needs to weather the cold months. More than that, he has the knowledge that he can weather them, that he's capable and competent and at home in this life he's chosen. "Thank you," he says softly to the night, to the stars, to the forest, to whatever force or fortune or simple chain of circumstances brought him here. "Thank you for another day." Then he turns and goes inside, closing the door gently behind him, sealing himself into the small warm haven he's created in the midst of the wild world. Thomas lies in his bed, cocooned in quilts he'd pieced together himself from old wool blankets and fabric scraps traded from neighbors. The cabin is dark except for the faint orange glow seeping through the gaps in the wood stove door, painting shifting patterns on the ceiling beams above him. He's not asleep yet. This liminal time between waking and dreaming is when his thoughts often wander deepest, when questions he doesn't ask during the daylight hours rise up and demand attention. Tonight, he's thinking about time. In his old life, time had been something to manage, to optimize, to squeeze productivity from. Every hour had needed justification. Leisure itself had been scheduled, blocked out in his calendar like an appointment with relaxation. Even his hobbies had felt like obligations, things he did because well-rounded people were supposed to have interests outside of work. Here, time moves differently. Or perhaps he moves differently through it. Thomas shifts slightly, finding a more comfortable position, his body settling into the rope bed frame he'd constructed, topped with a mattress stuffed with wool and dried grasses. The simplicity of even this, his bed, would have seemed like deprivation once. Now it feels perfect. Sufficient. Honest about what a bed actually needs to be. A comfortable place to rest. That word keeps coming back to him. Sufficient. It's become something of a North Star in this life, a measure against which he tests everything. Not, is this the best? Or is this impressive? But simply, is this sufficient? Sufficient warmth. Sufficient food. Sufficient shelter. Sufficient beauty. Sufficient challenge. Sufficient rest. The discovery that sufficiency could be enough, could actually be more than enough, had been revolutionary for him. He'd spent decades in pursuit of more. More money, more success, more square footage, more recognition, more everything. The treadmill of accumulation and achievement that everyone around him was also running on, all of them too breathless to ask why they were running or where they thought they were going. Here, he'd stepped off the treadmill. And the world hadn't ended. The sky hadn't fallen. Instead, something unexpected had happened. He'd discovered that enough was actually a place you could arrive at. Not a way station on the road to more, but a destination in itself. A revolutionary idea in a culture built entirely on the assumption that satisfaction always lies just beyond the next purchase, the next promotion, the next milestone. A log shifts in the stove, sending up a small shower of sparks that Thomas can hear more than see. The sound is comforting, a reminder that the fire is still alive, still doing its work of keeping the cold at bay. He thinks about the word work, and how its meaning has transformed for him. In the city, work had been abstract, divorced from its outcomes in ways that had always troubled him without his fully understanding why. He'd move money around, facilitate deals, help developers transform parcels of land into profitable ventures. At the end of the day, he'd have emails to show for it, documents with his signature, numbers in accounts that grew larger. But his hands were never dirty. His body was never tired in the way it should be after a full day of labor. The connection between effort and result was so mediated by systems and hierarchies and abstractions that it barely felt real. Here, work is immediate, undeniable. You split wood, and you have split wood. The pile grows in direct proportion to the effort expended. You plant seeds, tend them, and months later you harvest food that keeps you alive. The relationship is clear, honest, even beautiful in its simplicity. Cause and effect, effort and result, problem and solution. All of it direct, all of it comprehensible. Thomas has come to believe that this directness is essential to human well-being in ways modern life has forgotten. People need to see the results of their labor. They need to solve real problems, not abstract ones. They need to feel competent in ways that matter, not just competent at navigating bureaucracies or managing emails or attending meetings. He remembers a moment from a few months ago. He'd been splitting kindling, preparing for a cold snap that was forecast. His daughter had called, stressed about a project at work, something about stakeholder alignment and shifting priorities and interdepartmental communication breakdowns. As she talked, he'd continued splitting, the phone wedged between his shoulder and ear, his hands moving through the familiar motions. "I just don't know what I'm even doing half the time," she'd said, frustration thick in her voice. "Like, what's the point? I sit in meetings, I send emails, I fill out forms, and at the end of the day I can't even explain what I accomplished." "You sound like I used to," he'd told her gently. There'd been a pause. "Yeah, I guess I do." He hadn't pushed, hadn't suggested she follow his path. He knew better than that. Everyone has to find their own way, in their own time. But he'd felt a deep sadness for her, for all the people trapped in that particular kind of meaninglessness, that slow suffocation by abstraction. The wind has picked up outside, and Thomas can hear it moving through the trees, a sound like distant ocean waves, rhythmic and eternal. He listens, letting it fill the spaces between his thoughts. He's been considering the nature of freedom lately. Real freedom, not the kind advertised and sold as lifestyle choices and consumer options. In his old life, he'd thought of himself as free. He'd had money, which was supposed to equal freedom. He'd had choices: where to live, what to buy, how to spend his leisure time. The culture had told him over and over that freedom meant having options, having the resources to pursue whatever he desired. But he hadn't been free at all. He'd been bound by invisible chains: the need to maintain his income, the expectations of his profession, the lifestyle inflation that meant he always needed more money to sustain the life he'd built, the judgments of peers and neighbors and family about what success looked like. He'd been trapped in a maze of his own construction, and the walls had been so cunningly designed that he hadn't even recognized them as walls. Here, with so much less, he's found actual freedom. The freedom that comes from needing very little. The freedom that comes from being competent, truly competent, at meeting your own basic needs. The freedom that comes from stepping outside the systems of judgment and comparison that govern conventional life. He doesn't need to impress anyone. Doesn't need to keep up with anyone. Doesn't need to justify his choices or prove his worth through achievement and accumulation. He can simply be, simply live, simply do the work each day requires and find satisfaction in that. This is what Thoreau meant, Thomas thinks, when he wrote about the mass of men leading lives of quiet desperation. They're trapped in systems that promise fulfillment while systematically preventing it. They're running races they never agreed to run, toward finish lines that keep receding, wondering why they're exhausted and empty. But Thomas also knows his path isn't for everyone. Couldn't be, even if everyone wanted it. The world needs people doing all kinds of work, living all kinds of lives. His daughter's work matters, even when it frustrates her. Cities and systems and all the complex machinery of civilization serve real purposes, meet real needs. What troubles him isn't that people choose different paths, but that so many people don't realize they're choosing at all. They follow scripts they've inherited: college, career, marriage, house, children, retirement, without ever pausing to ask if these scripts actually serve them, actually lead to the kind of life they want to live. Thomas had been nearly 50 before he'd asked himself that question. Nearly 50 before he'd given himself permission to want something different, to define success in his own terms, to build a life that matched his values instead of society's expectations. "It's never too late," he whispers into the darkness. He says this sometimes, a reminder to himself, a message he wishes he could send to everyone still trapped in lives that don't fit. It's never too late to begin again. His thoughts drift to the concept of wealth, and how his understanding of it has changed. By conventional measures, he's poor now. He has almost no money, a small pension from his working years that covers property taxes and occasional purchases, supplemented by odd jobs he does for neighbors when cash is needed. He owns almost nothing of monetary value. His net worth, calculated the way financial advisors calculate such things, would be considered concerning, even pitiable. But Thomas feels wealthy in ways he never did when his bank account was full. He's wealthy in time. His days are his own, shaped by his choices and the natural rhythms of the seasons, not by anyone else's demands. He's wealthy in skills. He can build, repair, grow, forage, create. He's wealthy in health. His body is strong and capable from daily physical work. He's wealthy in peace. His mind is quiet, untroubled by the anxiety and restlessness that once plagued him. Most of all, he's wealthy in attention. In the capacity to notice, to be present, to experience his life as he's living it rather than always being half somewhere else, distracted by worries about future or regrets about past. This morning, watching that deer in the clearing, he'd been fully there for it. Not thinking about what he needed to do next, not mentally composing an email, not wondering what time it was. Just watching, being present with the deer's presence, two living beings acknowledging each other in the early light. How many moments like that had he missed in his previous life? Thousands. Tens of thousands. All that living he'd done while barely awake, barely present. His consciousness always fragmented across multiple concerns and commitments. Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity, someone had written. He can't remember who. But he understands it now. To give something your full attention is to truly honor it, to grant it the respect of your complete presence. And in a world designed to fracture attention, to keep everyone scattered and distracted and half-present, the ability to focus, to be fully here, fully now, has become a kind of superpower. Thomas realizes his breathing has deepened, that he's drifting towards sleep. He doesn't fight it. Sleep is another gift, another need to be honored rather than resented. But before he lets go completely, one more thought surfaces, something he's been circling around all evening without quite naming it. The question isn't, what do I want to do with my life? The question is, how do I want to feel? This realization seems important, maybe the most important thing he's learned in all his years here. Because he'd spent decades pursuing things, achievements, possessions, status, thinking they would make him feel the way he wanted to feel. Satisfied, peaceful, content, purposeful. But the things themselves had never delivered those feelings, not sustainably, not in any deep way. Only when he'd started with the feelings, when he'd asked himself what actually made him feel at peace, what actually made him feel purposeful, had he found his way forward. And the answer had surprised him. Simplicity made him feel peaceful. Direct relationship with his own survival made him feel purposeful. Being part of nature rather than separate from it made him feel connected. Solitude, surprisingly, made him feel less lonely than crowds ever had. He'd had to let go of almost everything he'd built to discover these truths about himself. Had to strip away all the noise and expectation and inherited ideas about what a good life looked like. Had to get quiet enough to hear his own actual desires, his own actual values, his own actual self. Know thyself, the ancient Greeks had said. But you can't know yourself when you're drowning in noise, buried under obligations, fragmented across 1,000 demands and distractions. You have to create space, physical space, temporal space, mental space, for that knowing to emerge. Thomas exhales slowly, feeling his body sink deeper into the mattress. Tomorrow will bring its own tasks, its own small challenges and satisfactions. There will be wood to split, water to carry, food to prepare. There will be the chickens to tend and the garden to check. There will be the forest to walk through, the creek to listen to, the changing sky to watch. Nothing urgent. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make for an impressive story at a cocktail party. Just a life. A real, actual, embodied life. The kind of life humans evolved to live, scaled to human proportions, comprehensible and manageable and deeply, deeply satisfying. Sufficient, Thomas murmurs, the word becoming a kind of prayer, a benediction. More than sufficient. Outside, an owl calls one final time, its voice carrying through the darkness. Thomas hears it, smiles slightly, and then lets himself slip under, down into the deep well of sleep, where his conscious mind can finally rest and his body can do its quiet work of restoration. In the morning, he'll wake again to birdsong. The cycle will continue. The earth will keep turning, the seasons will keep changing, and he'll keep living this small, deliberate, carefully chosen life that feels like the only life he was ever meant to live. For now, there's only this, warmth and darkness and the sound of his own breathing. The cabin holding him. The forest surrounding the cabin. The mountains holding the forest. The sky holding it all, star-pierced and infinite. Thomas sleeps, and in his sleeping, he's exactly where he belongs. The night deepens. The fire in the stove burns low but doesn't die. The temperature outside continues to drop, frost forming on every exposed surface, turning the world silver and still. Inside the cabin, Thomas breathes slowly, steadily, his body at rest, his mind finally quiet. This is enough. This has always been enough. The search is over, not because he's found all the answers, but because he's finally learned to live peacefully with the questions. Because he's discovered that the point of life isn't to accumulate or achieve or prove anything. The point is simply to be alive, to be present for it, to meet each day with attention and care and gratitude. Everything else, all the complexity, all the striving, all the noise, falls away. What remains is this: breath and heartbeat, warmth and shelter, the turning of seasons, the company of trees and birds and deer and stars. A life sufficient unto itself. A life that asks nothing of the world except what the world freely gives. A life that gives back what it can: attention, care, respect, gratitude. This is what Thomas has found in these woods. Not escape, not rejection of the world, but a different way of being in it. A way that feels true to something essential in himself, something that had been buried under years of doing what he thought he was supposed to do. The clock on the shelf ticks quietly, marking time that no longer feels like something to manage or escape. Just time passing, as it always does, carrying Thomas and everything else along in its patient current toward whatever comes next. The sound of a car engine laboring up the rough track pulls Thomas from his morning routine. He's at the woodpile, splitting kindling for the day, and he pauses mid-swing, listening. It's been 3 weeks since he's heard a motor vehicle, and for a moment his mind cycles through possibilities. A lost hiker, someone needing help, the elderly neighbor to the east who sometimes checks in. Then he remembers. Saturday. Late October. His daughter said she'd try to visit this weekend if she could get away. Thomas sets down the maul and walks around to the front of the cabin, brushing wood dust from his shirt. A blue sedan emerges from the tree line, bumping slowly over the rutted path, branches scraping against its sides. The car is completely wrong for this terrain. Too low, too clean, too urban, and Thomas feels a familiar pang of love mixed with concern. His daughter, trying to bridge worlds that sometimes feel impossibly far apart. The car stops, and Sarah emerges, unfolding her long legs carefully. She's 34 now, though Thomas still sometimes sees the 7-year-old who used to hold his hand during walks around the suburban neighborhood where they'd lived. She's wearing jeans and a fleece jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she looks tired in a way that has nothing to do with the drive. "Hey, Dad," she says, and her smile is genuine even if her eyes carry shadows. "Sarah." He crosses to her and pulls her into a hug, feeling how thin she's gotten, how tense her shoulders are. "I'm glad you came." "Me too. Sorry I'm later than I said. Work thing this morning I couldn't get out of." She pulls back and looks at him, really looks. "You look good. Healthy." "I am healthy." He gestures toward the cabin. "Come on. I just made tea." She grabs a backpack from the car and follows him inside. He watches her take in the space. She's been here before, several times, but she always seems to see it fresh, as if trying to reconcile the father she knew with the man who lives in this hand-built shelter in the woods. "It's so quiet here," she says, and he can't tell if it's appreciation or discomfort. You get used to it. Or rather, you start hearing all the sounds underneath the quiet. Birds, wind, the creek. He pours her tea from the pot on the stove, the same wild mint he drinks every morning. "How was the drive?" "Long. But beautiful once I got into the mountains." She accepts the cup and wraps her hands around it, even though the cabin is warm. "The leaves are incredible right now. Peak color this week. Another few days and most of them will be down." Thomas settles into his chair and gestures for her to take the other seat he keeps for visitors. A simple wooden chair he'd made, less comfortable than his but sturdy. "How's work?" Her expression clouds. It's fine. Busy. We're launching a new product line, So everything's intense right now. Lots of late nights. You look tired. I am tired. She sips her tea, and he sees her trying to taste it, trying to identify the flavor. Is this mint? Wild mint from down by the creek. I harvested it in July. She nods, turning the cup in her hands. They sit in comfortable silence for a moment. Something Thomas has learned not to fear, though he knows it makes Sarah uncomfortable sometimes. She's used to filling silences, to the constant stimulation of her urban life. How are you doing? She finally asks. Really? Thomas considers. I'm well. The garden did better this year than last. I've got enough wood split for winter. Fixed a leak in the roof before the fall rains came. I'm well. But are you happy? Are you? I don't know, fulfilled. He hears the real question underneath. How can this be enough for you? I'm at peace, he says carefully. Which is better than happy, I think. Happy comes and goes. Peace is something deeper. Sarah looks around the cabin again, at the simple furnishings, the oil lamps, the wood stove, the open shelving with its modest collection of dishes and supplies. I just can't imagine living like this. I mean, don't you miss everything? Running water, electricity, being able to just order food instead of having to grow it and hunt it and forage it. Sometimes, Thomas admits. On the coldest mornings when I have to break ice to get water, or when I'm down to root vegetables and dried beans in February. But missing something occasionally isn't the same as needing it. But why make it so hard? You have money saved. You could have a place with solar panels, a well with a pump, modern conveniences. You could still be out here, still be away from the city, but not live like it's the 1800s. Thomas smiles. I could. And maybe one day I will. I'm not ideological about it. But right now, this feels right. Living this simply keeps me honest, I guess. Honest about what I actually need versus what I've been taught to want. Sarah sets down her teacup with more force than necessary. That sounds like a judgment on the rest of us. Like we're all just mindless consumers and you've achieved some higher level of enlightenment. That's not what I meant. Thomas leans forward, keeping his voice gentle. Sarah, I'm not judging you or anyone else. I'm just telling you what works for me. You have to find what works for you. But you did judge me. You judged Mom. You judged your whole life before this. Her voice rises slightly. You walked away from everything like it was all worthless, like all those years were a mistake. Ah, there it is. The real conversation they've been circling around for 3 years, ever since she'd visited for the first time and really understood the extent of his transformation. The years weren't worthless, Thomas says quietly. They gave me you. They taught me skills I use here. Discipline, planning, problem solving. They weren't a mistake. They just weren't me. Not the deepest part of me. So what was I living with for 18 years? Some fake version of you. No. A partial version. A person trying to be what he thought he was supposed to be. He pauses, choosing his words carefully. Sarah, I loved being your father. I love being your father. That part was real. But I was also slowly suffocating, and I didn't know it until I couldn't breathe at all. She's quiet for a long moment, staring into her tea. When she speaks again, her voice is smaller, younger. I worry about you out here. What if you get hurt? What if you get sick? What if something happens and there's no one around to help? Those are real risks, he acknowledges. But there are risks everywhere. Heart attacks in office buildings. Car accidents on commutes. The illusion of safety isn't the same as actual safety. But you're alone. Doesn't that scare you? Sometimes. But loneliness scared me more when I was surrounded by people. At least here, when I'm alone with things that feel real. Trees and birds and seasons. Not alone in a crowd, pretending to connect. Sarah stands abruptly and walks to the window, looking out at the clearing. Thomas lets her have the silence, lets her work through whatever she's feeling. Finally, she turns back to him. "I think I'm unhappy," she says, and her voice cracks slightly. "I think I've been unhappy for a while, and I don't know what to do about it." Thomas's heart aches for her. He rises and crosses to stand beside her at the window, not touching, just present. "Tell me." "It's just, I do all the right things, you know? I have a good job, good apartment, good relationship. At least I think it's good, though lately I'm not sure. I exercise, I eat well, I have friends. On paper, my life looks exactly like it's supposed to. But I feel like I'm just going through motions. Like I'm playing a role in a play I didn't audition for." That sounds familiar. I know. That's what scares me. I don't want to do what you did. I don't want to walk away from everything. But I also don't know how to make it feel meaningful. Thomas turns to look at her. "You don't have to do what I did. This path is mine, not yours. But you do have to be honest with yourself about what you actually want, not what you think you should want. How do you even figure that out? You get quiet enough to hear yourself. You pay attention to what actually makes you feel alive, not what's supposed to make you feel alive." He gestures around the cabin. "This isn't about rejecting modern life or proving something. It's about finding what's true for you and having the courage to pursue it." "But what if I don't know what's true for me?" "Then you start experimenting. Small things. You don't have to quit your job and move to the woods. Maybe you start taking 1 day a week without your phone. Maybe you try growing some herbs on your windowsill. Maybe you take a weekend to go camping and see how it feels to be away from everything. You test and pay attention and see what resonates." Sarah turns back to the window. "When you were my age, were you already unhappy?" Thomas considers. "I was probably already unhappy, but I wasn't letting myself know it yet. I was too busy achieving, too invested in the story of success I'd built. It took another 15 years before I couldn't ignore it anymore. I don't want to wait 15 years. Then don't. You're already ahead of where I was. You're at least asking the questions." They stand together in silence, watching a chickadee land on the porch railing and regard them with bright, curious eyes. After a moment, Sarah speaks again, her voice thoughtful. "What's the thing you love most about this life?" Thomas doesn't have to think about it. The directness. "Everything here is honest. When I'm cold, I need to make fire. When I'm hungry, I need to find or grow food. When I'm tired, I rest. There's no performance, no pretense. Just me and what's real." That sounds lonely. It is sometimes. But it's also liberating. I don't have to be anyone other than who I am. There's no one to impress, no expectations to meet except the basic ones of survival. Sarah nods slowly. "I spend so much energy managing how people perceive me. At work, in my relationship, even with friends. I'm always calculating, always performing. It's exhausting." "I know. I did it for decades." He pauses. "But you know what's interesting? When I stopped performing, when I let go of all that management and calculation, I didn't lose anything real. The things that fell away were things that didn't serve me anyway." "Did you lose friends?" "Some. But the ones I kept, or the new ones I've made out here, those relationships are more honest. We show up as we are, not as we think we should be." The chickadee flies away, and Sarah finally turns from the window. "Can I stay tonight? I brought a sleeping bag." "Of course. I'd like that. Will you teach me something? Some skill you use here?" Thomas smiles. "What do you want to learn?" "I don't know. Something useful. Something real." "Let's bake bread," he says. "It's a good skill, and there's something meditative about it. And we need to eat anyway." They spend the next few hours working together in the small kitchen space. Thomas shows her how to mix the dough, flour he'd traded for, water from the filter, salt, a bit of sourdough starter he's been maintaining for years. He teaches her how the dough should feel, how to knead it, how to sense when it's right. "You can't rush it," he explains as they work the dough together. "It needs time to rise. You have to trust the process and wait. Everything here is about patience, isn't it?" Sarah says, but she doesn't sound critical anymore, just observant. Everything worth doing is about patience. While the dough rises, they walk down to the creek. Thomas shows her the fish trap, the wild plants growing along the bank, the animal tracks in the mud. He points out a hawk riding thermals high above, a cluster of shelf mushrooms growing on a fallen log, the way frost patterns linger in shaded spots even though the sun is bright. Sarah takes it all in, asking questions, really looking. And Thomas sees something in her face shift, a softening, an opening, as if some tight thing inside her is beginning to unclench. They return to the cabin and shape the dough, place it in the Dutch oven, and set it in the hot coals of the wood stove. The smell of baking bread fills the small space, and Sarah closes her eyes, breathing it in. "That smells like home," she says. "What does home mean to you?" Thomas asks. She opens her eyes, considering. "I don't know. I thought it was my apartment, but it doesn't feel like home. It just feels like a place I sleep. Home is where you can be yourself, where you don't have to perform or pretend. Maybe you haven't found yours yet." "Maybe," she says quietly. When the bread is done, they eat it warm with butter Sarah brought from the city and honey from Thomas's neighbor. They eat slowly, savoring, and the bread tastes like time and patience and the simple alchemy of basic ingredients becoming something nourishing. "I made this," Sarah says, wonder in her voice. "I actually made bread." "You did. And you can make it again, wherever you are. It doesn't require all this," he gestures around the cabin. "Just time and attention and basic ingredients." As the afternoon lengthens into evening, they continue talking. Sarah tells him about her work, and he listens without judgment, helping her untangle what parts she actually enjoys from what parts she endures out of obligation. She tells him about her relationship. A good man, she says, but maybe not her man. She tells him about friends who feel more like acquaintances, about days that blur together, about the sense of time slipping away without her really living it. And Thomas shares what he's learned, that there are no universal answers, only personal ones. That choosing a life requires courage, whether that life is conventional or unconventional. That the hardest thing is being honest with yourself about what you actually want, not what you've been taught to want. "I spent so many years trying to want the right things," he tells her. "Trying to make myself fit into a shape that would make everyone else comfortable. And I was miserable, even though I couldn't admit it." "When did you finally admit it?" "When the pain of staying became greater than the fear of leaving." Sarah nods, absorbing this. "I'm not there yet. But I can feel myself getting closer." "That's okay. You're allowed to take your time. You're allowed to figure it out at your own pace." As darkness falls, Thomas lights the oil lamps, and they sit together in the warm glow. Sarah seems different now, less tense, more present. She's not checking her phone, not thinking about what comes next. She's just here in this moment, in this small cabin in the woods with her father who chose a strange life but who maybe, she's beginning to understand, chose a true life. Thank you, she says finally. For what? For not giving up on yourself. For showing me that it's possible to change, even if it's scary. For being honest, even when that honesty was hard for me to hear. Thomas feels emotion rise in his throat. You don't have to thank me for that. Yes, I do. She looks at him directly. You're braver than I am. No. I'm just older, and it took me longer to figure things out. You're asking questions at 34 that I didn't ask until 49. That's not less brave. That's smarter. Sarah smiles, and for the first time since she arrived, it reaches her eyes. Maybe I'll come visit more often. If that's okay. It's more than okay. You're always welcome here. Maybe next time you can teach me something else. How to identify plants, or start a fire without matches, or something. I'd like that. They sit in comfortable silence as the night deepens around them, father and daughter, separated by choices and lifestyles but connected by love and by something new. A mutual respect, an understanding that there are many ways to live and that finding your own way is the work of a lifetime. Outside, the owls begin their evening calls. Inside, the fire crackles. And between them, something has shifted. Some bridge has been built across the distance that had been growing between their worlds. Sarah will leave tomorrow, return to her city life, to her job and her apartment, and all the questions she's still working to answer. But she'll carry something new with her, the memory of this day, the smell of bread she baked with her own hands, the feeling of being present without performance, and the understanding that change is possible, even if the shape of that change isn't yet clear. And Thomas will remain here in his cabin, living his careful, deliberate life, but warmed by the knowledge that his daughter sees him now, really sees him, and that maybe, in some small way, his choice to live truthfully has given her permission to seek her own truth, whatever form that might take. The morning arrives with a peculiar silence, the kind of quiet that makes even silence feel loud. Thomas wakes in the deep blue hour before dawn and knows immediately, before he even opens his eyes, that snow has come. He rises and moves to the window, his breath fogging the cold glass. The world has transformed overnight. Everything is white, softened, made new. The clearing, the woodpile, the chicken coop, the trees, all of it blanketed in at least 8 inches of fresh snow that's still falling in thick, lazy flakes. The first real snow of the season, earlier than usual for late October. Thomas dresses quickly in layers, thermal underwear, wool pants, 2 shirts, his heavy sweater, thick socks. The cabin is cold. The fire has burned down to almost nothing during the night. He builds it back up carefully, coaxing flame from ember, and while he waits for warmth to spread, he stands at the window and watches the snow fall. There's work to do. Always work to do. But especially now, with winter announcing itself so definitively. He makes his morning tea and eats a quick breakfast of oatmeal with dried apples and walnuts, standing at the counter rather than sitting, his mind already moving through the day's necessary tasks. The chickens will need checking. They'll be fine in the coop, but they'll need fresh water, and he'll need to make sure their small run is cleared enough for them to move around. The woodpile nearest the cabin should be restocked from the main shed. The roof should be checked for any spots where snow might collect and cause problems. And most importantly, he needs to check on Agnes. Agnes is his nearest neighbor, the elderly woman who lives about 3/4 of a mile to the east. She's 82, has been living in these mountains for 40 years, and is tougher than most people half her age. But she's also alone, and after a snow like this, the unspoken protocol of the mountain is clear. You check on your neighbors. Thomas pulls on his heavy boots, his warmest coat, a wool hat and gloves. He fills a thermos with hot tea and wraps 2 pieces of the bread Sarah helped to make. It's only been a few days since her visit, and the bread is still good. He adds a jar of his preserved venison and puts everything in a canvas pack. Outside, the cold hits him immediately, sharp and clean. The snow is still falling, muffling sound, turning the familiar landscape into something dreamlike and strange. Thomas's first steps leave deep prints, and he knows the walk to Agnes's place will be harder than usual, but that's precisely why it's important to go. But first, the chickens. He wades through the snow to the coop and opens the small door. Henrietta, Mabel, and Pip cluster inside, fluffed against the cold but otherwise unbothered. Thomas scatters feed and breaks the ice that's formed in their water dish, replacing it with fresh water from the cabin. They won't lay much in winter. The short days and cold suppress their production, but they'll give him enough, and more importantly, they'll provide company and purpose. Stay warm, ladies, he tells them, securing the coop against the weather. Next, he makes several trips from the main woodshed to the covered area by the cabin door, carrying armloads of split wood and stacking it where he can reach it easily even in deep snow. The work warms him despite the cold, and he finds himself falling into the rhythm of it. Walk, load, carry, stack, repeat. Meditation in motion. By the time he's finished, the morning has fully arrived, though the heavy cloud cover and falling snow make it hard to tell. Thomas shoulders his pack and sets out toward Agnes's place. The walk is beautiful and difficult in equal measure. Beautiful because the snow has transformed everything, has simplified the landscape into essential shapes, the dark verticals of tree trunks, the white horizontals of ground and fallen logs, the gray dome of sky. Difficult because the snow is deep enough to make each step an effort, and the trail he usually follows has disappeared entirely. He has to navigate by memory and by reading the forest, the slope of the land, the spacing of familiar trees, the distant sound of the creek that runs between his property and Agnes's. Thomas moves slowly, conserving energy, pausing often to catch his breath and check his bearings. His body is strong from years of physical work, but he's also 63, and he knows better than to push beyond his limits, especially alone in winter conditions. As he walks, his mind drifts to Sarah's visit, to their conversations, to the bread they'd made together. He wonders if she's back in her apartment now, back in the rhythm of her city life, or if something has shifted in her. He hopes she's being gentle with herself, giving herself time to figure out what she wants rather than what she thinks she should want. The thought of her makes him think of legacy, not in the conventional sense of money or property passed down, but in the sense of what he's teaching her simply by living as he does. The permission to choose differently. The courage to be honest with yourself. The understanding that there are many ways to live well, and that finding yours requires both bravery and patience. After 30 minutes of steady walking, Agnes's cabin comes into view through the trees. It's smaller than Thomas's, older, built in a style that speaks of someone who learned their craft through necessity rather than books. Smoke rises from the chimney, a good sign, but Thomas still feels relief when he sees it. He calls out as he approaches, the protocol of mountain living. You don't surprise people who live alone in remote places. Agnes! It's Thomas! The door opens before he reaches it, and Agnes appears. A small, wiry woman with white hair braided down her back and eyes that miss nothing. Figured you'd come, she says, but she's smiling. Come in, come in. You must be frozen. Inside, her cabin is warm and cluttered in a comfortable way. Herbs hanging from rafters, shelves packed with jars and tins and books, a wood stove radiating heat, 2 cats curled on a braided rug. It smells like wood smoke and dried plants and something baking. I brought tea and bread, Thomas says, shrugging off his pack. And I've got soup on. Sit. They settle at her small table, and Agnes ladles out bowls of soup thick with vegetables and beans. Thomas contributes his bread, and they eat together, talking about the snow, the early arrival of winter, what it might mean for the months ahead. This kind of snow in October usually means a hard winter, Agnes says. But we've seen worse. Remember 3 years ago? Thomas does. 3 years ago, they'd had snow by early October and it hadn't really melted until late April. It had been a test of preparation, of resilience, of the ability to find beauty and purpose even when trapped in cold and dark for months. We managed then, we'll manage now, he says. Agnes nods, her eyes sharp on his face. You will. You've learned well. Not many people your age could have done what you've done. Built a life from nothing, taught yourself everything you needed to know. I had good teachers. He means her, among others. You were a good student. Some people come to the mountains thinking it'll solve all their problems. You came knowing you had to solve your own problems, and the mountains would just be a place to do it. Thomas considers this. I came looking for something real. Something I could understand and trust. And did you find it? Yes. Though it's not what I expected. I thought I was looking for simplicity, but what I found was complexity. Just a different kind. Everything here is connected to everything else. You can't understand one thing without understanding 100 other things. Agnes smiles. That's wisdom talking. The young think simple means easy. The old know simple just means honest. They finish their soup, and Thomas helps her bring in more firewood from her shed, stacking it in the covered alcove by her door. They check her small pantry together. She's well stocked with preserved foods, dried goods, root vegetables stored in sand. She'll be fine through the winter, as she's been fine through 40 winters before this one. You'll come again after the next big snow? She asks as Thomas prepares to leave. Of course. And you'll signal if you need anything. She gestures to the window where a red cloth hangs on a nail. If it's in the window, you'll come. If it's not, I'm fine. It's their system, worked out years ago. Simple and effective. Thomas heads back toward his cabin, but he takes a different route this time, one that curves north through a section of forest where the big oak stands, the one he'd assessed weeks ago, the one he'd decided needed to come down before winter. The snow has made everything more difficult, but as Thomas approaches the tree, he realizes the timing might actually be perfect. The ground is frozen now, which means he can fell the tree without worrying about damaging the forest floor as much. And the cold weather is ideal for hard physical work. He'll stay warm from exertion rather than overheating as he would in summer. He studies the tree carefully, walking around it, checking the lean, the surrounding space, the direction of the wind. The oak is massive, and felling it will be serious work. Dangerous work, if done carelessly. But Thomas has learned to respect the danger while not being paralyzed by it. Life here requires accepting risk, taking calculated chances, trusting your skills while remaining humble about your limitations. Not today, though. Today is about assessment, about confirming his plan. He'll come back tomorrow with his saw and wedges and rope, with a clear head and full energy, and he'll spend the day doing the careful work of bringing this giant down safely. Thomas places his hand on the oak's trunk, feeling the rough bark, the solid mass of it. Tomorrow, he tells the tree. Tomorrow we'll begin. The walk back to his cabin takes another half hour, and by the time he arrives, he's thoroughly tired in the way that comes from sustained effort in cold weather. But it's a good tired, an honest tired. He's checked on his neighbor, restocked his wood, assessed his next major project. He's done what needed doing. Inside, the cabin is still warm from the morning fire. Thomas adds more wood, changes into dry clothes, and makes himself a proper lunch. The venison soup he'd intended for Agnes but hadn't needed to leave, along with fried potatoes and the last of the kale from his garden, wilted now but still good. As he eats, looking out at the snow that continues to fall, Thomas thinks about the conversation with Agnes, about what she'd said regarding simplicity and honesty. He thinks about the work ahead, the oak to fell and process, the long winter to navigate, the ongoing cycle of tasks that keep him alive and comfortable. None of it is easy, but all of it is real. That evening, after the snow has finally stopped and the clouds have begun to break apart, Thomas stands on his porch and watches the last light fade from the sky. The world is utterly transformed, pristine and white, every branch laden with snow, every surface smooth and unmarked except for his own trails and the delicate tracks of animals beginning to venture out. The temperature is dropping fast. It'll be well below freezing tonight. And tomorrow will bring new challenges. The path to the creek will need breaking through. More wood will need bringing in. And there's the oak, waiting. But for now, there's this. The blue hour light, the hushed world, the smoke rising straight from his chimney into still air. The knowledge that he's prepared, that he's capable, that he's exactly where he needs to be. A deer emerges from the tree-line, perhaps the same doe from weeks ago, though in the snowlight it's hard to tell. She moves carefully through the deep snow, and Thomas watches her, both of them silent, both of them part of this landscape, both of them doing what they need to do to survive. The deer moves on, and Thomas returns inside to the warmth and light of his cabin. Tomorrow he'll fell the oak. The day after, he'll begin processing it. The winter will deepen, and he'll meet it as he's met everything else here, with attention, with respect, with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing yourself and your capabilities. He stokes the fire one last time before bed, banks it carefully for the long night ahead, and settles into his chair with his book. Outside, the temperature continues to drop. Inside, warmth and light hold back the dark. And Thomas reads until his eyes grow heavy, grateful for another day lived fully, another day of work and purpose and the simple satisfaction of being competent in the life he's chosen. The next morning arrives cold and crystalline clear. Thomas wakes before dawn, as always. But this morning something feels different. The quality of the light coming through the window, perhaps, or the particular hush that speaks of a world held perfectly still. He rises and moves to the window, and what he sees stops him completely. The snow has stopped. The clouds have cleared. And the world has been transformed into something beyond description. Every surface covered in fresh snow that catches the first hint of dawn light and throws it back in shades of blue and rose and gold. The trees stand like sentinels, their branches heavy with white, and above them the sky is shifting from deep indigo to the pale translucent color of ice lit from within. Thomas stands at the window, not moving, barely breathing, simply witnessing. This is why. The thought arrives without words at first, more a feeling than a statement. But as he continues to watch the light change, moment by moment, breath by breath, the understanding clarifies. This is why he came here. Not for the simplicity or the self-sufficiency or even the peace, though all of those matter. He came here for this, the ability to be fully present for moments like this one. To witness beauty not as something consumed or captured or checked off a list, but as something experienced with his whole being, with nothing between him and the world except the thin glass of a window. In his old life, he would have missed this. Would have been rushing to get ready for work, or checking his phone, or thinking about the day's obligations. Even if he'd glanced outside and registered "pretty sunrise," he wouldn't have stopped. Wouldn't have given it his full attention. Wouldn't have let it fill him the way it's filling him now. Thomas pulls on his warmest clothes, moving quietly, reverently, as if sudden movement might shatter something fragile. He makes no fire yet, prepares no breakfast. Some things are more important than warmth or food. Some moments demand to be met on their own terms. He steps outside into air so cold it catches in his lungs. His breath plumes white and hangs in the still air. Nothing is moving. No wind. No animals. Nothing. The world is holding its breath. Thomas walks to the center of the clearing, his boots crunching through the crusty top layer of snow, and he stops. He turns slowly, taking it all in, the cabin behind him, smoke no longer rising from the chimney, the forest surrounding him on all sides, every tree distinct and perfect in the growing light, the mountains visible in the distance through gaps in the trees, their peaks glowing pink with alpenglow. And the sky. The sky is performing miracles. As the sun approaches the horizon, still hidden behind the eastern ridge, the light intensifies. The clouds that remain, high, thin cirrus clouds, catch fire, turning from pink to orange to a red so deep it looks like the sky is bleeding beauty. The snow reflects it all, amplifies it, turns the entire world into a cathedral of light. Thomas feels something in his chest expand, as if his heart is growing too large for his ribcage. Tears prick at his eyes, not from sadness, not from cold, but from the sheer overwhelming fact of being alive, of being here, of being capable of witnessing this. How many sunrises like this have there been? How many has the earth performed for an audience of trees and birds and deer? How many will there be after he's gone? The numbers are incomprehensible, and yet this one, this singular, unrepeatable sunrise on this particular morning, is his to witness. The gift of it staggers him. He thinks about all the mornings he missed. All the years he spent indoors under fluorescent lights, or rushing from car to office, or sleeping through dawn because he'd stayed up too late staring at screens. All that time the world was doing this, offering up beauty and wonder and transcendence, and he'd been too busy, too distracted, too caught up in the machinery of modern life to notice. But he notices now. He's trained himself to notice. That's what these 12 years have been. An apprenticeship in attention, in presence, in the art of being fully alive to the moment he's living in. The sun breaks the horizon. One moment the ridge is dark, and the next, a sliver of brilliant gold appears. Then more and more still, until the full disk of the sun is visible, so bright Thomas has to squint against it. The world ignites. Shadows leap into existence, long and blue across the white snow. The trees cast their shadows like declarations. Every ice crystal, every snow-laden branch, every surface catches and throws back light. Thomas realizes he's laughing. A quiet, wondering laugh. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy at the staggering beauty of existence. A raven calls from somewhere in the forest, its voice harsh and perfect. The sound breaks the spell of silence, and suddenly the world is moving again. A small cascade of snow falls from an overburdened pine branch. A chickadee appears and lands on the porch railing, cocking its head at Thomas as if to ask what he's doing standing in the snow without purpose. Witnessing, Thomas tells the bird. Just witnessing. The chickadee seems to accept this and flies off about its business. Thomas remains a while longer, watching as the extraordinary light of sunrise settles into the ordinary light of morning. Extraordinary becoming ordinary, but no less miraculous for the transformation. He understands something in this moment that he's been circling around for years. The point of life isn't to collect peak experiences or to always be in some heightened state of awareness. The point is to be present enough that you can recognize the sacred in the ordinary, the extraordinary in the everyday. To see that every moment, every single moment, contains the whole universe if you're paying attention. This sunrise is glorious, yes. But so was the quiet evening with Sarah, making bread together. So was the conversation with Agnes over soup. So is the simple act of splitting wood, of filtering water, of watching chickens scratch in the dirt. All of it matters. All of it is holy, if you approach it with presence and attention and care. Thomas finally turns and walks back toward the cabin. His feet are cold now, and his stomach is reminding him that beauty doesn't eliminate the need for breakfast. But he's changed by what he's witnessed. Renewed. Reminded of why he makes the choices he makes, why he accepts the hardships and the loneliness and the risk. Inside, he builds up the fire and starts his morning tea. As he moves through these familiar rituals, he notices everything. The way the kindling catches flame, the smell of the wild mint steeping, the warmth gradually spreading through the cabin, the play of firelight on the log walls. Each small thing receives his full attention, and in giving it his attention, he honors it. This is the practice. Not some grand achievement or dramatic transformation, but simply this, showing up fully for the life you're living. Not the life you wish you were living, not the life you think you should be living, but the actual, immediate, right-now life that's unfolding moment by moment. Thomas carries his tea to the window and looks out at the day. There's work ahead, the oak tree waiting to be felled, firewood to be brought in, the 100 small tasks that winter demands. But right now there's just this: warmth in his hands from the cup, steam rising and dissipating, morning light on snow, and the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where he is. A memory surfaces. His last day in the city, 12 years ago. He'd stood in his empty apartment, all his possessions sold or given away, everything reduced to what would fit in the truck, and he'd felt a moment of pure terror. What was he doing? Was he making a terrible mistake? How could he walk away from everything he'd built? But underneath the fear had been something else, a bone-deep knowing that he had to do this. That if he didn't, he would spend the rest of his life wondering. That the risk of trying and failing was smaller than the risk of never trying at all. Standing here now, 12 years later, Thomas can see that the person who left that apartment and the person who stands in this cabin are both him and not him. He's changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. He's shed so much, ambition and anxiety, and the constant low-level hum of dissatisfaction that had colored everything. But he's also gained so much: competence and confidence and a sense of rightness, of being aligned with himself in some fundamental way. The journey hasn't been smooth. There have been mistakes and failures, moments of deep loneliness, times when he questioned whether he'd gone too far, isolated himself too much. Winter nights when the wind screamed and the cold felt personal, malevolent. Times when he was sick and alone and frightened. Times when he missed human connection so acutely it felt like physical pain. But he wouldn't trade any of it. Because all of it, the hardship and the beauty, the loneliness and the peace, the fear and the confidence, all of it has been real. Undeniably, authentically real in a way that his previous life never was. Thomas finishes his tea and sets the cup down. Through the window, he watches the chickadee return, this time with 2 companions. They flit from branch to branch, tiny sparks of life against the white world, and he smiles at their industry, their aliveness, their complete presence in the moment. He thinks about Sarah, about their conversation, about the questions she's asking herself. He hopes she finds her answers, whatever they might be. He hopes she learns what he's learned, that there's no single right way to live, but there are ways that are right for you. That the courage isn't in making the biggest change or the most dramatic gesture, but in being honest with yourself about what you actually need to feel whole. For him, it was this: the woods, the solitude, the direct relationship with his own survival, the daily practice of presence and attention. For her, it might be something entirely different. The specifics don't matter. What matters is the honesty, the willingness to listen to yourself and trust what you hear. Thomas moves away from the window and begins preparing breakfast. As he cooks, he finds himself humming. No particular tune, just a wordless expression of contentment. The eggs sizzle in the pan. The last of Sarah's bread toasts on the stovetop. The coffee, a luxury he allows himself, traded for with Agnes, fills the cabin with its rich aroma. He plates his food and sits at the table, and before he eats, he pauses. Not for prayer exactly, though it's prayer-like. Just a moment of acknowledgement, of gratitude. For the food, for the warmth, for the morning light, for being alive, for having found his way to this life that fits him like skin. "Thank you," he whispers. And then, because it's true, this is enough. This is more than enough. He eats slowly, tasting everything, present with every bite. When he's finished, he washes his dishes and begins preparing for the day. The oak awaits. The work awaits. But there's no hurry, no pressure. Just the steady rhythm of one task following another, each one approached with care and attention. As Thomas pulls on his work clothes and gathers his tools, he feels something settle in him, a deep, abiding sense of rightness. This is his life. These are his days. This is what he's chosen, and in choosing it, he's found something most people spend their whole lives searching for. A sense of being at home in himself, in his days, in his world. He steps outside into the bright cold morning, ready for work, ready for whatever the day brings. Above him, the sky is impossibly blue. Around him, the forest stands silent and snow-covered. Ahead of him, the path to the oak tree waits, marked now by his own footprints from yesterday. Thomas shoulders his saw and begins walking. Each step crunches in the snow. Each breath plumes white in the cold air. And with each step, he's here. Fully, completely, undeniably here. Not thinking about where he's been or where he's going, but simply present with the walking itself, with the cold on his face, with the weight of the saw on his shoulder, with the morning light filtering through the trees. This is it. This is the thing that can't be explained to someone who hasn't felt it, can't be understood from the outside, can only be lived, the profound satisfaction of being present for your own life, of showing up fully for the ordinary moments, of finding meaning not in some distant achievement or future goal, but in the immediate, tactile, undeniable reality of now. Thomas reaches the oak and sets down his saw. He walks around the tree one more time, checking his plan, making sure of the angles and the clearances. Then he picks up the saw, settles into his stance, and begins. The saw bites into the wood. The familiar rhythm begins. Push, pull, push, pull. Sawdust falls like snow onto snow. The work is hard, physical, demanding. But Thomas's mind is quiet. His body knows what to do. And as he works, as the saw cuts deeper into the ancient oak, he feels connected to something larger than himself, to the tree and the forest, to all the people who've ever done hard work with simple tools, to the long chain of human existence that stretches back to the first person who ever felled a tree for warmth or shelter. Hours pass. The sun climbs higher. The oak begins to lean. And finally, with a crack that echoes through the forest, with a great rushing sigh, the tree falls exactly where Thomas intended it to fall, settling into the snow with an impact he feels through the soles of his boots. Thomas steps back, breathing hard, sweat cooling on his skin despite the cold. He looks at the fallen giant, at the massive trunk that will provide firewood for years to come, at the gap in the canopy where light will now reach the forest floor and new growth will begin. "Thank you," he tells the tree, as he tells everything that gives him what he needs. "Thank you for your warmth." And then he stands there, in the snow, in the sunlight, in the cold, in his body, in his life, and he feels it. The absolute rightness of being exactly here, exactly now, exactly himself. This is why. This moment. This presence. This aliveness. This is why he came to the woods. This is what he was searching for without knowing how to name it. This is what he's found, and what he wakes up to every morning, and what he'll carry with him through whatever years remain. The simple, extraordinary gift of being fully alive while he's alive. Of not sleepwalking through his days. Of meeting each moment, hard or beautiful, ordinary or sublime, with his whole self. The wind picks up slightly, moving through the trees, dislodging small showers of snow that catch the light and fall like diamonds. Thomas tips his head back and watches them fall, and he laughs again, that same wondering laugh of joy and gratitude and recognition. He's home. Not just in this place, but in himself. And that, finally, is enough.